2005 will always have a special place in my memory, but in this case, special doesn't altogether mean good. Me and my circle of high school friends were all high school sophomores, which meant that there was a lot of transitioning going on in our lives, and the way we celebrated Halloween was changing too. We'd spent our childhoods trick-or-treating, and a lot of the time that was in the company of a chaperone. Then from like 12 to 14, we'd been allowed to go trick-or-treating on our own. But now that we were like 15 going on 16, we figured that we were too old to go begging for candy. And unlike the year before, there was no Halloween parties, at least none we'd been invited to anyway. This meant that we were stuck for something to do on what had become one of our favorite nights of the year, and the way we saw it, we needed to fix that, and fast. I know we could have just met up at one of our parents' places for pizza and horror movies, but trick-or-treating had conditioned us with a need to be outside on Halloween. On such a special, spooky night of the year, we needed to be out there, in the dark, soaking up that feeling of excitement in the air. The night before Halloween was a Sunday that year, and I remember that very well, because I spent almost all day glued to MSN Messenger, checking to see if anyone had found anything fun for us to do. Then, out of nowhere, our friend Brian came in with a clutch telling us that we could hang out with his older cousin Cody and his friends over at some abandoned school down by the river. Cody and company were a few years older than us, and they went to a different high school, but we'd hung out with them before. And word was that they were getting a few 12-packs of Bud Light that they didn't mind sharing if we each pitched in a few bucks, and it was music to my ears. Who cared if we weren't invited to some dumb costume party with other sophomores? We were going to have a campfire, tunes, and most importantly, beer. Halloween itself fell on a Monday, and the whole day at school, me and my friends were all super psyched for that night. I get home, eat some food, and get some homework done. Then, right as I'm getting ready to head out, my mom pokes her head into my bedroom and drops a bomb on me. She wanted me to walk my little brother around the neighborhood so he could go trick-or-treating. It meant that I'd be an hour late to our Halloween hangout, at the very minimum, and I was not happy about that. But since Mom told me it was that or face being grounded, I just sucked it up and did as I was asked. Maybe an hour and a half later, I get my brother back home, then immediately rush out again, calling my friends to make sure that they're at the hangout spot. I find out that they are, so I practically run the whole way, hoping there's still a few cans of Bud Light with my name on them. When I arrive at the hangout spot, I find it's this abandoned kindergarten that's all fenced off and derelict. I can hear the music playing already, and I can smell the campfire smoke too, but after finding the hole in the fence and rocking up to the hangout, I don't see any beer except for what's in people's hands. And that's when the guys tell me that they've stashed the beers in some abandoned house behind the back fence, and that since I was late, it was my turn to go get everyone a fresh one. They said that their logic was that if the cops showed up, they wouldn't be able to take all the bud, just what people were drinking. If we got busted, we could just bail and circle back and grab the beers and carry on with our night somewhere else. This made perfect sense to me at the time, so I go off towards the fence where there's yet another hole in the plastic chain-link fence. I don't know what the deal was with there being two abandoned properties so close to each other, but the back of the kindergarten basically led right onto the empty home's backyard. It was all overgrown and stuff, so I had to basically wade through all this long grass as I walked towards the back door and these two big panel windows. It was dark, but I'd been given a flashlight and directions on where the beer was stashed. But then as I'm walking towards the open back door, I hear someone moving on the inside. Seconds later, under the beam of my flashlight, I see a figure emerge in the doorway. They were limping, trying to move as fast as they could, and as soon as they came into view, I recognized them as one of the older kids from Cody's group. Immediately, I'm panicking because not only did they appear to be hurt in some way, but they had this look of absolute terror on their face when they realized that I was there, and he cried out, "Dude, help me!" I'm too freaked out to even ask what's going on at first, but then right as I'm about to do something, the guy screams as someone behind him starts trying to drag him back into the house. I knew that I had to help, but I also knew that I couldn't do anything just on my own. I had to go get the other guys. I bolted back towards the rear of the yard, pushing myself through both sets of fences, one wooden, one plastic chain link, until I'm back at the abandoned kindergarten. I run the whole way there, hurtling around the corner of one of the derelict buildings until I was back in the company of my friends. Then right as I'm about to tell them that we need to go get help, they just crack up laughing. I'm talking wheezing, wailing, screeching, rolling on the floor kind of laughing, and I realize that I'd just been pranked hard. Everyone's all like, "You should have seen your face," doing dumb impressions the way I was running, and to be fair, it was pretty funny. At least for a moment or two. I remember just standing there, taking it on the chin, nodding along as if to be like, "All right, you got me." Then after a while, one of Cody's buddies calmed down enough to ask me what Jay had done. Jay was the one I'd seen in the doorway, the same guy who had begged for help in such a convincing way that it was nothing short of Oscar-worthy. And when I told them all that, they started cracking up again. Apparently, they'd been planning to prank me as soon as they found out that I was going to be late, and as soon as I'd placed my little confirmation call on the way out, Jay had gone off to hide in preparation for my arrival. But then, I mentioned to the guys how the thing that had made me run was how Jay had gotten grabbed from behind, then dragged back into the house. I assumed that they'd sent someone else with him to make the whole thing more convincing. But then when I mentioned the grabbing thing, the laughter started to fade. I remember Cody being all like, "What? Who got grabbed?" But I took this as him playing dumb, a prank within a prank, if you will, prankception. I repeated what I said about Cody being grabbed, and the laughter peters out completely. Cody gives one of his buddies this worried look, then turns back to me like, "Please tell me you're kidding me." I told him no, swearing that I'd seen someone grab him and that the whole screaming for help thing seemed a little too convincing. And then it hit me. Someone attacking Jay had not been part of the prank. What I'd witnessed wasn't some well-executed way of frightening me. It had actually been real. The thought must have hit everyone else right at the same time, but instead of standing there all dumbstruck like me, they just went hurtling off in the direction of the abandoned house. I followed, feeling extremely guilty that I should have done something right there and then instead of rushing back to get help. We pushed our way through the fences as fast as we could, and I can hear the older kids yelling ahead of us, Jay, where are you, man?" Flashlight beams are zooming everywhere as they piled into the house, checking every room until they found him. And when they did, they found a total mess. Jay had been beaten up so bad that I could hardly recognize him. I'd seen his face maybe only a few minutes before, but in that time, someone had seriously worked him over. There was blood all over his mouth, and some of his clothes were ripped, but the thing I really remember was how he was awake, but he'd just been lying there because he said that he couldn't move. Every time someone tried to get him up, he'd clutch his chest and cry out. There were a few seconds where we thought that he might have been stabbed or shot or something, and we had to make sure that the only blood was coming from his mouth before we were able to breathe a small sigh of relief. But still, it was only a small one. If he was hurt so bad that he couldn't get up, there was seriously something wrong with him. Because we were on some old abandoned property, the firefighters had to cut through chains that were holding the gate shut in order to get Jay on a stretcher. And because the 911 call had mentioned some kind of violent assault, the cops showed up not long after the firefighters did. Thankfully, they weren't interested in the fact that we'd clearly been drinking, and were much more concerned with how Jay had ended up being taken to the hospital. Obviously, I had the most to tell them, but even then, it wasn't much, and we had to wait until Jay was out of the hospital to really figure out what happened. Not that we didn't visit him when he was there, he just wasn't in any mood to talk about it. Whoever had attacked Jay broke his ribs, broke the bone around his eye, and had kicked him so many times in the stomach that he had internal bleeding. As you can imagine, he was in the hospital for quite a while afterward, and in that time, the cops conducted a full investigation, keeping his parents in the loop the whole time so they knew what was happening. Long story short, the empty house across from the derelict kindergarten was being used as a stash house. The other guys said they checked the place out earlier that evening but hadn't heard anyone moving around upstairs, so they just assumed the place was empty. Little did they know, there was some guy upstairs, Probably some low-level dealer or something, and of course he's paranoid and losing his mind because he can hear voices coming from downstairs. Then, later on, Jay decided to explore the house a little to work out the best place to jump scare me, which is how he ended up walking up the stairs. He said when he got to the top, it was just like, wham. The guy came out of nowhere and basically kicks him back down the stairs, and that's about the same time I appeared in the garden and turned on my flashlight. Jay gets up, limps to the door, sees my flashlight, and the rest, you already know. I think what happened that night amounts to the single scariest thing that's ever happened to me as a kid or as a teenager, and to this day, I've never seen anyone look as scared as Jay did when he looked into the beam of my flashlight and cried out to me, "Help." I just wish I did something.
Years ago, when I was a